Oh, hell internet, I'm recording a double barrel video, I've got stuff to do and I need to get thoughts out, so forgive me, I have tried to structure this essay, but it might lack a certain something. As a fan of CosmicSkeptic, I have seen his recent advocacy for veganism, and unsurprisingly, it's extremely thought-provoking. Now, I don't claim to be as well-read on this issue. I've never read Peter Singer, although I have heard him speak on this, including with Skeptic himself. But as a person who does still eat meat and has reflected somewhat, this is how I still regard the issue. And I say this because I have actually started to reduce meat eating myself, but only as a vegetarian, and the initial basis for this was, and I think continues to be, mostly environmental. Meat, and yes, dairy, is one of the primary contributors to climate change, and the ease with which we can all cut down on meat is fairly appealing to me. It's not like food cannot be delicious and plant-based, and if you are a meat eater watching this, can I just recommend to you chili, bolognese, fried rice and curry. All of these meals can be 100% as satisfying with vegetarian or vegan ingredients. I've done the studies, all right? Trust me. But I don't ever see myself completely giving up on meat, and unless lab-grown meat becomes more accessible, that means I will continue to be involved in the death of animals. Part of this, I concede, is cultural, but cultural does not mean trivially changed. I don't really like seafood. While I was growing up, it was not something that was on the dinner table, and even the few prawns I did have were shelled and soulless. The same goes for offal. With the exception of liver, we just didn't have organ meat, and to this day, I have trouble associating those things with the idea of food. Since moving to Thailand, I've had the opportunity to try more dishes with these ingredients, and I have developed my tastes a bit, but not completely. The instinctive reaction remains. If we draw back our perspective now and look at the mass individual of humanity, animals as food is an association that stretches back further than humanity itself. To claim that our shiny new frontal cortex and systems of rational thought can just overcome that in a handful of generations, it seems like a brave idea, and I mean that in both a satirical and a genuine sense. Occasionally, activists will express surprise that children get these ideas about justice that adults just can't grasp. But it's not remotely surprising that this would be the case. Youthful human systems are receptive to a broad array of cultural ideas because they have not yet settled on what culture they're living within. Adult brains have culturally hardened, and this is biologically based. Now, it's not the end of the argument, of course. There are plenty of people who turn vegan after the age of 25, but it is a part of the argument. I would say that this points us to the existence of a limit on how quickly a culture can be marshalled to move in a new direction. This does not, of course, negate activism. Activism creates the impulse for change. However, activism does not establish the current moral standard, and the current moral standard is that animals can be food. Now, I'm sliding towards moral relativism here, and in a way, so be it, but let me deal with that now. I think humanity has got a fairly good moral standard, the golden rule, and maybe this could be considered a universal moral standard for sentient organisms. The golden rule is not tied to any one human tradition, it's clearly seen independently in different places, so let us assume for now that it truly is a universal moral standard. The next question then must be what interpretation of this standard allows organisms and subsequently conscious creatures to become food for other organisms or conscious creatures? Well, at the most fundamental level, life feeds on life. Unless you are photosynthetic or chemosynthetic, then you consume life to remain alive. Life does not have the purpose of being eaten by you. Fructarians represent. Of course, organisms which have developed a nervous system have experience of the external world, and we can see that. We can see that they have developed behaviors. And insofar as we humans recognize behaviors of a certain type, we do see consciousness there. Prior human cultures did recognize this, and there was more respect between pre-agricultural humans and the animals they hunted. But for complex life to have a food source, there has to be a point at which we draw a line on sentience, cellular agriculture notwithstanding. There's a famous comparison between ants, humans, and galactic civilizations. When humans need to destroy ants, they do. Almost trivially. I live with ants around the place, and I probably kill a score a day. And just like the beginning of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, some galactic civilization might be inclined to destroy a non-spacefaring planet like ours for reasons of complete indifference. We hope that they would not, but we don't know. And any moral judgment about that event turns on the line where relevant sentience is drawn. And I feel that this rightly changes or is relative to a point in time within a culture. As the science and culture has brought viable vegan diets into our range, in the modern world at least, the moral standard will move in that direction. But it is fighting against some quite core aspects of our neuroscience. But wait, you might say, lots of animals live on plant-based diets and previous human cultures largely did too. How can we suggest that veganism was not viable for early humans? Well, going back far enough, I don't think they would have been early humans. Before I mentioned the frontal cortex, and it is crucial to this issue because it's the only reason we're able to have these discussions about morality at all, or consider them to be important. The prefrontal cortex was developed in the later stages of evolution in primates and in dolphins, but it's largest in humans, and only humans have crossed that line into true technology and culture. I think it's fair to say. And one of the things that allowed this to take place was the mastery of fire and the cooking of food, especially meat. Again, this is overly simplistic, but there is a sense in which humans are only able to consider the merits of veganism because of our meat-eating history. And I think it's fair to say that we're much closer to that part of our evolutionary context than we like to admit. That being said, it was also our frontal cortex that allowed us to discover that you can make a pretty good bechamel sauce with just butternut squash and cashew nuts. So I don't want to sell short the ability of rational thought patterns to change behavior. So here I am, still a mostly unrepentant meat eater, with one asterisk which I will mention below, although I do try to imagine the animal that is attached to the meat I consume, in much the same way as I might imagine the life of people in poverty that I have sympathy for, but will not be giving half of my earnings to. I think one very interesting point Skeptic has made is that he believes a worldview that impersons animals would immediately help to negate other types of prejudice. The obvious retort here would be to say, well, how are we ever going to do that with animals if we can't even do it with other races, for example? But this is exactly why it is an interesting point. I'm not sure he's wrong. Maybe we can more easily get the human race to agree to the universal agency of suffering before we can get it to agree to its own universal humanity. And frankly, what does that say about us? On the other hand, maybe the very fact that slavery once existed and we were able to end it serves as a counterpoint to this idea of veganism first. So as you may know, if you're going to put a gun to my head and force me to identify as something on the broadest level, then I identify as a secular Taoist, and I'm just going to reframe the issue in those terms briefly. Not expansively, but just to give a flavour of where I'm coming from. My first statement will be very reductive. To go cold turkey, so to speak, on meat eating is a very yang action for humanity. There's a high amount of control there, and it may be an excessive amount. Now, this all depends on how many people change their diet over what length of time, but the degree of control that is expressed in a wholesale change is not necessary, which is not to say it's unnecessary or impossible. I don't want to sound like a spineless incrementalist here. I am receptive to ideas for some kind of systemic change, and I'll mention that a bit later. But who knows, maybe there is some perfect argument that will convince humanity to abandon meat over the course of a mere century. But I doubt it. The maelstrom that is humanity does not seem to be so easy to control, and even if it could be, there might be some unforeseen psychological impact on a cultural level. Let's just talk about humanity and control. Humanity is an organ of control in the universe on a different level to any other animal, even those which have similarly advanced brains. And as such, this control will be expressed. We can argue over the virtues of antinatalism or question whether our exploitation of the planet puts our technology on some dubious moral grounds, but the universe has demonstrated a tendency to express complexity, and humanity is one emergent expression of that complexity. And for the reasons discussed above, that expression exerts control on the universe in different ways. Put bluntly, the temperament of humanity is still chained to the idea of animals as food in a way that makes it subject to the control we exert on the universe. I've only talked about control here, the yang rather than the yin, and this is because control by its nature is more easy to identify. That's kind of the point. But surrender, of course, is important here. You might say that individual humans or humanity as a whole is surrendering to its immoral impulse to continue eating meat. Fair enough. You could also say that by giving up eating meat as a species, we're surrendering something inside ourselves which has been there as long as we can remember. And that doesn't mean we shouldn't do that. It just means it's something to consider. I'm not laying out a deductive argument here, especially not from the Taoist perspective. That's kind of antithetical to the whole point. Basically, what I am saying, I think, is that the vegan argument is a good one, but the vegan ideology is in some sense counterproductive to the argument, and this must be very frustrating to hear for vegans. I'm almost saying that your argument undermines your argument, which I'm not really saying, and I don't want to be like that. Perhaps look at that vegan teacher who is an outspoken advocate of the ideology. And she's obnoxious, I mean, right? I feel like she's supposed to be honest. She's playing up a little. I don't doubt her sincerity, of course, but I think she has a brand where she's offering herself up as a straw man almost, so other vegans can say, hey, but at least we're not that vegan teacher, right? And if that's her lane, then brilliant, honestly. But I think we're actually on a path. I agree that one day humanity will disconnect from this idea of animals as food. Our control will express itself in a different way. But I disagree with the more militant idea that humanity will one day look back at our present selves with horror and judgment at the barbarism. And if we do, it may be to our detriment. Except there is that one asterisk that I wanted to mention, right? I haven't talked about factory farms yet, and of course I must. They are indefensible. Not as bad as chattel slavery perhaps, but of the same kind of offence to the golden rule. We may not grant animals the same rights as we humans have, but we can certainly agree that if we were a pig, we sure as shit would not want to be kept in those conditions. And I'm still involved here. I can't say that I ethically source all of my consumed meat. What I will say is that factory farms have emerged out of a model of animal husbandry that could be construed as just in the Rawlsian sense. That is to say that the inequalities are permissible because they are beneficial to the least favoured. For most of history, one could make an argument that farmed animal species benefited from having humans as their natural predator. Their populations increased steadily, most individuals lived a life which in some way resembled life in a state of nature, and generally their safety increased from other predators. We could argue over the perceived autonomy of conscious creatures and the inherent cruelty of a coerced life, but if we accept this model in principle, then in the pre-industrial era, the idea of animals as food was a just one. Somewhere we crossed a line. Maybe with hindsight we could ask why somebody didn't realise that, these new industrial processes are not really the sort of thing we should be inflicting on animals, right? But the population was growing, technology was booming, and we just kind of fell into it. Now, from what I've seen of CosmicSkeptic's rhetoric on this subject, I can imagine him as incredulous in response. How could we possibly fall into a moral crime of this magnitude? But that's the point about the banality of evil, right? It's not about making these conscious decisions to be monsters. And I think Alex is aware of this, of course. But we don't have an active will to commit atrocities. Nonetheless, we have done. On the bright side, I think this gives us positive hope for undoing this genuine atrocity and abandoning factory farming. And I do appreciate that when I eat less meat, that means I'm less involved in this system. but it's just too easy and cheap to be involved right now. Life is hard and nobody's perfect. I could go on in different directions, I'm sure, but I feel like I've gone on long enough. Like I say, I do not claim to be totally informed on every moving part of these issues, but I would hazard that I'm more informed than most people. If anyone has any rebuttals to my perspective, then please let me know, and love to everyone out there, whether you're herbivore, omnivore, or carnivore. Bye for now.